A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was quiet in that way that made Sarah's skin prickle with awareness, the kind of silence that spoke of predators lurking just beyond sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And after 2 years of traveling alone through territories that didn't want her, she'd learned to trust that primal instinct that told her when danger was near. Her silver hair, long and flowing down to her waist like a waterfall of moonlight, was hidden carefully beneath the hood of her worn cloak, because standing out in neutral territories was an invitation for trouble, the kind of trouble that a lone Omega couldn't afford to attract. Not when there was no pack to protect her, no family to avenge her if something went wrong, no one who would even notice if she simply disappeared into the wilderness and never emerged again. She'd been walking for 6 hours since dawn, her boots crunching through the fresh snow that had fallen during the night, each step leaving a solitary trail behind her that would be covered by the next snowfall, erasing all evidence that she'd ever passed this way, which was exactly how she preferred it these days, because invisibility meant safety, and safety meant survival. The settlement she was heading toward was supposed to be another day's journey, a small frontier outpost called Frost Hollow, where she'd heard they needed a healer, someone skilled with herbs and basic medical care, the kind of work that didn't require her to use the gift she'd sworn 2 years ago never to touch again, the empathic ability that had made her valuable to her old pack and utterly disposable as a person. Sarah found a frozen stream cutting through the forest and knelt beside it, using the hilt of her knife to break through the thin layer of ice that had formed overnight, the sharp crack echoing through the silent woods in a way that made her wince because sound carried in winter forests, carried to ears that might be listening, might be hunting. She scooped the ice-cold water into her hands and drank deeply, ignoring the way it made her teeth ache and her throat burn, because discomfort was just another part of survival, another price paid for the freedom of being nobody's tool, nobody's obligation, nobody's problem to solve. Her reflection stared back at her from the broken ice, and she saw what she always saw now: silver hair that marked her as different, pale skin that made people uncomfortable with its almost translucent quality, and gray eyes that held too many shadows for someone who'd only lived 24 years. 2 years, Sarah, she said aloud to herself, a habit she'd developed during the long, lonely months of traveling alone, talking to fill the silence that sometimes felt like it might swallow her whole if she let it. 2 years and you're still alive, still moving, still surviving, and that's something, isn't it? That counts for something. But even as she said the words, she felt the hollowness in them, because surviving wasn't the same as living, wasn't the same as thriving or being happy or having purpose beyond simply making it to the next day. She'd been surviving since the night of her would-be mating ceremony, the night Darius Blackwood had stood before the entire Silverpaw pack and rejected her with words that still echoed in her mind during the darkest hours before dawn, when sleep refused to come and memories demanded their due. "I can't mate with someone who's been tainted by everyone's darkness," he'd said, his voice carrying across the ceremony clearing with cruel clarity that ensured everyone heard, everyone understood, everyone knew exactly why he was rejecting her. "She's like a sponge for misery, absorbing every negative emotion in the pack until there's nothing left of who she actually is, and I want a real Omega, not an emotional dumping ground, not someone who's been used by so many others that there's nothing original left inside her, nothing pure, nothing that's just hers." The pack alpha had agreed enthusiastically, had actually smiled when he'd announced that Sarah would remain unmarked and available to the entire pack, because her gift was too valuable to waste on a single mate, too useful for keeping aggressive wolves calm and territorial disputes manageable, too important to be monopolized by one male's selfish desire for a bonded partner. They'd presented it as an honor, as if being used by everyone instead of cherished by someone was somehow better, somehow more valuable, somehow a blessing instead of the curse it actually was. Sarah had learned her gift at 16, when it had manifested during her first shift. This ability to absorb and neutralize negative emotions through physical touch, to take someone's rage or grief or fear and pull it into herself where it could be processed and dispersed, leaving the other person calm and centered while she dealt with the emotional aftermath alone. Her parents had been proud at first, had called it a rare blessing from the moon goddess herself, but they died in a rogue attack before they could see how their daughter's gift would be exploited, how the pack would use her again and again until she had no idea where other people's emotions ended and her own began, until she was so full of absorbed darkness that she couldn't feel her own light anymore. She'd spent years being summoned whenever an alpha got too aggressive, whenever a dispute threatened to turn violent, whenever someone needed to be calmed so decisions could be made rationally instead of emotionally, and the pack had never asked if she wanted to help, never considered that each time she absorbed someone's rage or grief, it stayed with her for hours or sometimes days, that she had to process and neutralize every emotion she took in, that the toll was cumulative and crushing and slowly destroying who she'd been before the gift manifested. And then they'd tried to keep her unmarked, permanently, tried to ensure she'd always be available as a resource instead of a person. And Sarah had finally understood that she would never be anything more to them than a tool, a solution to their problems, a gift to be exploited until there was nothing left of her except the ability they valued and the shell that contained it. So she'd run, had walked out of Silverpaw Pack territory the night of her failed mating ceremony, with nothing but a pack of supplies and the clothes on her back, and she'd been running ever since, moving from settlement to settlement, never staying long enough to form attachments, because attachments meant obligations, and obligations meant someone would eventually discover her gift and want to use it. The wind picked up suddenly, cutting through her cloak with icy fingers that made her shiver despite the layers of clothing she wore, and Sarah looked up at the sky to see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the kind of clouds that promised a serious storm, possibly a blizzard given how quickly they were moving and how heavy they looked with unshed snow. She needed to find shelter soon, needed to get off the exposed trail and into somewhere protected before the storm hit, because being caught in a blizzard in neutral territory, with no pack to search for her if she got lost, was essentially a death sentence, and she'd survived too much to die from something as mundane as freezing to death in a snowstorm. She stood and adjusted her pack, checking to make sure everything was secured properly, because once the storm hit, she wouldn't be able to stop and reorganize, wouldn't have the luxury of taking her time with anything except survival. There should be caves in this area, she remembered from the maps she'd studied in the last settlement, natural formations in the mountainside that travelers used as emergency shelter when the weather turned dangerous, and if she could just find one before visibility dropped to nothing, she'd be able to wait out the storm in relative safety. Cold, perhaps, but alive. Sarah pushed forward with renewed urgency, her eyes scanning the rocky outcroppings and cliff faces that bordered this section of the trail, looking for any sign of an opening, any indication of shelter, anything that might keep her alive through what was promising to be a brutal storm. The temperature was dropping rapidly now, the wind gaining strength with each passing minute, and she could feel the first stinging kiss of snowflakes against her exposed face, the storm's leading edge announcing its arrival with frozen kisses that would soon become a blinding assault. She'd been traveling alone for so long that sometimes she forgot what it felt like to have someone waiting for her somewhere, someone who cared if she made it through the night or succumbed to the elements, someone whose life would be affected by her absence. And there was a deep loneliness in that realization that had nothing to do with physical isolation and everything to do with the bone-deep knowledge that she'd made herself invisible to avoid being used, and in doing so, had also made herself unmissed, unimportant, utterly alone, in a way that went beyond simply lacking a pack. But alone was safe, she reminded herself firmly as she climbed over a fallen log and pushed through a thicket of bare branches that caught at her cloak and scratched at her hands with skeletal fingers. Alone meant no one could force her to use her gift, meant no one could reduce her to a tool, meant she controlled her own life, even if that life was small and lonely and consisted mostly of surviving rather than thriving. And surely that was better than being valuable only for what she could do instead of who she was. The snow was falling heavily now, thick flakes that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet ahead. And Sarah felt the first touch of real fear because she still hadn't found shelter, and the storm was intensifying faster than she'd anticipated, faster than should have been natural for this region at this time of year. She pulled her cloak tighter and kept moving, kept searching, kept hoping that the moon goddess hadn't abandoned her completely, even though she'd felt abandoned by everything and everyone for the past 2 years. And then she felt it. A pull so strong it was almost physical, an instinct that grabbed her attention and yanked it to the left, away from the trail she'd been following, toward what looked like nothing but a sheer cliff face that would be suicide to approach in this weather. But Sarah had learned during her years of isolation to trust her instincts because they were the only reliable guide she had, the only thing that had kept her alive through countless dangers, the only voice that had never lied to her or used her or asked for more than she could give. So despite every logical reason to ignore the pull, despite the seeming impossibility of finding shelter in that direction, despite the exhaustion that made her legs feel like lead and her mind feel fuzzy with cold and fatigue, Sarah turned away from the trail and pushed toward the cliff face, following an instinct she didn't understand but trusted more than her own rational mind, because sometimes survival meant listening to the parts of yourself that operated below conscious thought. The ancient wolf wisdom that knew things the human mind couldn't explain. The snow was blinding now, the wind howling with a fury that suggested this wasn't just a natural storm, but something more. Something wrong. Something that made her wolf senses scream danger, even as her human mind struggled to understand what exactly was setting off those internal alarms. She could barely see 3 feet ahead, could barely keep her eyes open against the assault of wind and ice, could barely force her legs to keep moving when everything in her body screamed to stop, to rest, to give up. But giving up had never been an option, not when she'd fled her pack, not during the countless nights of sleeping rough in the wilderness, not during the times when loneliness had felt like a physical weight crushing her chest and making it hard to breathe. And it certainly wasn't an option now when she was so close to finding shelter, so close to surviving another day, so close to proving once again that she was stronger than the world that had tried to break her. And then she saw it, hidden behind an outcropping of rock that had been completely invisible from any other angle. A dark opening in the cliff face that promised shelter from the storm, protection from the elements, a chance to survive the night. Relief flooded through her so intensely, it made her knees weak and her eyes burn with tears that had nothing to do with the wind, and everything to do with the overwhelming gratitude of finding safety when she'd been certain she was about to die alone, in a blizzard, in neutral territory where no one would ever find her body. Sarah stumbled toward the cave entrance, already imagining the relief of getting out of the wind, the small comfort of being protected from the worst of the storm's fury. maybe even the possibility of building a small fire if there was dry wood and adequate ventilation. But as she reached the entrance, just as she was about to step from howling chaos into sheltered darkness, she heard it clearly despite the storm's roar, a sound that made every instinct scream danger, made her wolf side bare its teeth in warning, made her freeze with one foot still in the snow and one hand braced against the cave's stone entrance. Whimpering, low and pained and coming from deep inside the cave, the sound of something injured, something suffering, something that could be either victim or predator, depending on what exactly was making that desperate, agonized noise that cut through the storm and straight through her healer's heart. The sound came again, weaker this time, but unmistakable in its desperation. A whimper that spoke of pain and fear, and the kind of suffering that Sarah had spent her entire adult life trying to ease in others, even when it cost her dearly, even when absorbing their pain left her empty and aching and wondering if she had anything left of herself to give. Every survival instinct she'd honed over 2 years of solitary travel screamed at her to turn around, to find another shelter, to leave whatever was making that sound to its fate, because injured animals were dangerous and unpredictable, and getting involved with unknown creatures in unfamiliar territory was the kind of mistake that got lone omegas killed, their bodies never found, their disappearances never investigated, because nobody cared enough about wandering wolves without packs to ask questions when they vanished. But even as her rational mind cataloged all the reasons to walk away, to prioritize her own survival over whatever was suffering in that cave, Sarah found her feet carrying her forward into the darkness, her hand reaching instinctively for the small knife she kept strapped to her thigh, not because she thought she could fight off a serious threat, but because having a weapon in hand made her feel slightly less defenseless, slightly less like prey walking into a predator's den. The cave entrance was narrow, but widened quickly once she was past the opening, and as her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from outside through the snow-covered entrance, she could make out the general shape of the space, could see that it went back much deeper than she'd expected, could sense rather than see that she wasn't alone in here. Her empathic gift, dormant for months because she'd built walls around it so high and so thick that it couldn't activate without her conscious permission, suddenly flared to life with an intensity that made her gasp and stumble against the cave wall, her free hand pressing against the cold stone as waves of emotion crashed over her like a physical force. Pain, so much pain that it made her knees weak and her stomach turn. The kind of agony that came from serious injury, from bodies pushed beyond their limits, from wolves who were dying slowly and knew it, and beneath the pain was fear. Not the simple fear of death, but something deeper and more complex, a terror of failure, of letting someone down, of not completing some vital mission or task. And there was something else beneath the pain and fear. Something that made Sarah's breath catch and her heart start pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with recognition, with connection, with a pull so powerful and undeniable that it bypassed her conscious mind entirely and spoke directly to her wolf, her soul, the parts of herself that existed beyond rational thought or careful self-protection. The mate bond, she realized with dawning horror and wonder. The legendary connection that supposedly existed between wolves destined to be together. The thing she'd stopped believing in after Darius's rejection. Because how could the moon goddess have fated her to someone who found her so fundamentally unacceptable, so tainted by her gift, that he couldn't stand the thought of binding himself to her permanently? But there was no mistaking the sensation now, even though she'd never felt it before, even though she'd convinced herself it was nothing but romantic fantasy wolves told themselves to justify their choices. even though accepting its existence meant accepting that somewhere in this cave was someone the universe had supposedly designed specifically for her. She pushed away from the wall and moved deeper into the darkness, following the sound of labored breathing and the overwhelming emotional signature that her gift was picking up, now that her walls had crumbled under the assault of so much concentrated suffering. And what she found, when her eyes finally adjusted enough to make out details in the dim light, made her stop dead and stare in shock and confusion, and something that might have been awe if she'd been in a state of mind to identify her own emotions clearly. Wolves, 12 of them, all massive beyond anything she'd seen before. Their bodies sprawled across the cave floor in a rough defensive circle that spoke of training and discipline even in their obvious distress. And every single one of them had pure white fur that seemed to glow even in the cave's darkness, seemed to catch and hold what little light filtered in from outside and reflect it back with an otherworldly quality that made them look more like spirit wolves from ancient legends than actual flesh and blood creatures. They were elite guards, Sarah recognized immediately. Her time in Silverpaw Pack having taught her to identify the signs of military training, the way they'd positioned themselves, even while injured and exhausted, to maintain some semblance of protective formation. The sheer size and obvious conditioning that marked them as warriors rather than ordinary pack wolves, and elite guards only served one type of wolf, one level of authority, one kind of leader who commanded that degree of loyalty and discipline. An alpha king, her mind supplied even as her body was already moving forward, her healer's instincts overriding her self-preservation because she'd never been able to walk past suffering, had never been able to ignore pain when she had the ability to ease it, even when helping meant risking herself, even when getting involved meant potentially exposing her gift to yet another group who would want to use it. The wolves noticed her approach immediately, 12 sets of eyes in various shades of ice blue and silver, fixing on her with an intensity that should have been terrifying, but somehow wasn't. Perhaps because she could feel through her empathic sense that despite their size and obvious capability for violence, they were too exhausted and injured to pose an immediate threat, were actually relieved to see another wolf, even though they didn't know her. Didn't know if she meant them harm or intended to help. The largest of the 12, a massive beast with ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, and a presence that screamed alpha even in his obvious distress, made a soft chuffing sound that wasn't aggressive, wasn't a warning, was almost welcoming in its tone despite the wariness she could sense beneath it. "I'm going to help you," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside, but pitched to carry to wolf ears, pitched to soothe and calm, because her voice had always been one of her tools, even before her empathic gift manifested, had always been able to gentle frightened animals and ease suffering creatures. "If you'll let me, I'd like to examine your injuries, see what I can do to help you survive until this storm passes and you can get proper treatment." The large alpha wolf held her gaze for a long moment that felt like an eternity, those ice-blue eyes weighing and measuring and judging her in ways she couldn't begin to understand, and then he slowly, deliberately, lowered his massive head in what could only be interpreted as permission, as acceptance, as trust, given despite having no reason to trust a strange Omega who appeared out of a blizzard offering help. The other wolves relaxed slightly at their leader's acceptance, their defensive postures easing just enough to show they wouldn't attack her while she tried to help, wouldn't see her presence as a threat as long as she didn't prove herself to be one. Sarah spent the next hour moving among them, her hands gentle as she examined injuries that ranged from minor to severe, her empathic gift feeding her information about internal damage and pain levels, even as her eyes assessed external wounds, and her trained healer's mind cataloged what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. 3 of the wolves had deep gashes from what looked like a rock slide, wounds that needed cleaning and binding to prevent infection, and 2 showed signs of severe hypothermia despite their thick winter coats. Their body temperatures dangerously low, their breathing shallow and labored in a way that suggested they were closer to death than life. The others were exhausted, but relatively uninjured, pushed beyond their limits by whatever journey had brought them to this cave. And none of them seemed able to shift back to human form, which meant they were either too drained of energy to manage the transformation or too injured to risk it. And either way, it suggested they'd been in crisis for longer than just the few hours this storm had been raging. "You need warmth," Sarah said, thinking out loud because it helped her organize her thoughts when faced with overwhelming situations, helped her prioritize and plan when everything felt chaotic and impossible. "I need to build a fire, get the temperature up in here, especially for the 2 with hypothermia, but I don't have much in the way of supplies, certainly not enough firewood for a blaze large enough to warm 12 wolves this size." She moved to her pack and pulled out what she had, the meager collection of supplies she'd gathered over weeks of careful scavenging. Never enough, but always something, always just barely sufficient to keep her alive another day. She had fire-starting materials, thank the moon goddess, flint and steel, and some dry tinder she'd been hoarding for emergencies, and there was deadwood scattered around the cave floor, debris that had blown in over time or been dragged in by previous occupants. Not enough for a roaring fire, but enough for something. Enough to at least try to raise the temperature a few degrees. It took her 20 minutes to get a fire going, coaxing sparks into flames and flames into a small but steady blaze that cast dancing shadows on the cave walls and provided a circle of warmth that she immediately directed the 2 hypothermic wolves toward, helping them drag their massive bodies closer to the heat, her hands gentle as she positioned them to get maximum benefit from the flames. She could feel their gratitude through her empathic sense, could feel the way the warmth was slowly bringing them back from the edge of death, could feel their pain easing just slightly as their bodies began to thaw and circulation improved. The large alpha had been watching her work with those intense eyes, tracking her every movement with an attention that made her hyper-aware of his presence, even when her back was turned to him, even when she was focused on treating the others, and she could feel something building between them through the mate bond that she was trying desperately to ignore, trying to wall off because acknowledging it meant complications she absolutely could not afford. She moved to him next because his injuries seemed moderate rather than severe, but his emotional state was the most complex, was a tangled mess of guilt and fear and responsibility and self-loathing that made her chest ache with sympathetic pain, even though she wasn't actively trying to absorb any of it. "You're their leader," she said quietly as she examined a deep scratch across his shoulder that had clotted but needed cleaning. Her hand steady despite the way her heart was racing, despite the way the mate bond was singing between them every time her skin made contact with his fur. "You feel responsible for their condition, for whatever happened that brought you all here in this state, and you're carrying guilt that isn't entirely yours to carry, because sometimes things go wrong, no matter how well we plan, no matter how strong we are, no matter how much we want to protect the people who depend on us." The wolf made a sound that was almost human in its emotional complexity, a whine that spoke of recognition and surprise that she could read him so clearly, could understand what he was feeling without him having to explain. And Sarah felt the full weight of his emotional burden crash over her like a wave, felt his memories trying to force their way through the connection that was forming between them. She saw flashes of things she didn't understand, a palace made of ice and stone, a throne room full of hostile faces, a woman with silver hair like her own lying dead in a pool of blood, a young boy screaming as he transformed into this massive white wolf for the first time and couldn't stop the rage that consumed him. 12 years of episodes where he lost control and hurt people he cared about. The desperate search for a solution that never came. The bone-deep certainty that he was cursed and broken and unfit to lead, despite the responsibilities he couldn't escape. Sarah jerked her hands away from his fur as if burned, her breathing harsh and ragged, because she hadn't meant to open herself up that completely, hadn't meant to let her walls down far enough that his memories could bleed through into her consciousness, hadn't wanted to know his pain this intimately, because knowing meant caring, and caring meant involvement, and involvement meant exactly the kind of complications she'd spent 2 years running from. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady, to maintain the careful control she'd cultivated over months of solitary travel. "I didn't mean to intrude on your memories like that. Didn't mean to see things that weren't meant to be shared. But my gift, it sometimes shows me more than just current emotions, when the connection is strong enough, when the bond between wolves is powerful enough to bypass normal boundaries." The alpha wolf was staring at her with an expression that was far too human for an animal face, an expression that mixed shock and recognition and something that looked dangerously like hope. And she knew in that moment that he'd felt it too, had felt the mate bond snap into place between them, had felt the connection form despite the fact that they'd never met before, despite the fact that she didn't even know his name or his pack or why 12 elite wolves were dying in a cave during an unnatural blizzard. She opened her mouth to say something, though she had no idea what words could possibly address the enormity of what had just happened between them. But before she could speak, before she could try to explain or deny or acknowledge the bond that was now undeniably present, the large alpha's body went rigid, his eyes suddenly flashing from ice blue to pure, molten silver, and the temperature in the cave plummeted so drastically that Sarah's breath fogged in the air and frost began forming on the stone walls. The other wolves scrambled away from their leader with movements that spoke of long practice, of a protocol they'd followed many times before, creating a perimeter that kept them between their alpha and the cave entrance while leaving Sarah trapped inside the circle with him. And she realized with growing horror that whatever was happening to him was the thing she'd seen in his memories, the rage episodes he couldn't control, the curse that had defined his life for 12 years and left bodies in its wake. His massive frame was shaking now, trembling with the effort of fighting whatever was overtaking him, and through their newly formed bond, she could feel his terror, not of what might happen to him, but of what he might do to her. The innocent Omega, who'd only tried to help, and was now going to pay for her kindness with her life, because he couldn't control the monster that lived inside him. "Run!" The word came out garbled and inhuman from his wolf throat, forced through vocal cords not designed for human speech, strained with the massive effort it was taking him to maintain even that small amount of control. "Please, run now, before I can't stop it anymore." But Sarah found that her feet wouldn't move, found that despite every logical reason to flee, despite the very real danger he posed, despite the fact that she could feel the rage building in him like a tidal wave about to crash over everything in its path, she couldn't leave him to face this alone, couldn't abandon him to the guilt of hurting her, when she could feel how desperately he was fighting to protect her even from himself. She'd spent 2 years running from attachment, from involvement, from caring about anyone or anything except her own survival. And in one moment of touching this strange alpha wolf, she'd felt more connection, more understanding, more recognition than she'd felt in all her time with her old pack. and she couldn't walk away from that no matter how dangerous it was to stay. So instead of running, instead of choosing self-preservation over connection, instead of doing the smart, safe, reasonable thing that would ensure she survived to see another sunrise, Sarah moved forward toward the trembling Alpha, whose eyes were now completely silver, and whose body temperature had dropped so low that standing near him felt like standing next to a glacier. And she reached out with both hands and pressed her palms against his massive chest, right over where his heart was hammering like a war drum. And she opened herself completely to her gift, tearing down every wall she'd built over 2 years of self-protection, allowing her empathic ability to activate fully for the first time since she'd fled her pack. The rage hit her like a physical blow. 12 years of accumulated fury and grief and self-hatred pouring into her through the connection between her hands and his body. And Sarah heard herself gasp as the darkness flooded through her, as she felt every moment of his suffering, every person he'd hurt while unable to control himself, every ounce of guilt and shame and self-loathing he'd carried alone for over a decade. And it was more than she'd ever absorbed before, more than she'd thought was possible for one wolf to contain, enough darkness to drown her if she wasn't careful, enough pain to break her if she let it. But Sarah had learned something during her 2 years of isolation that she hadn't fully understood when she'd been surrounded by pack members who demanded her gift without offering anything in return. And that lesson was this: absorbing darkness by force and absorbing darkness by choice were two entirely different things, and one would drain you until nothing remained, while the other, paradoxically, could actually fill you up in ways that defied logical explanation. She didn't just absorb Aldrich's rage and pain and accumulated trauma, didn't just take it into herself and struggle to process it alone the way she'd done countless times before for wolves who saw her as nothing more than a convenient tool for managing their emotional mess. But instead, she opened herself completely to the connection between them, to the mate bond that was flaring golden and bright beneath the surface darkness. And she let her own emotions flow back through the link, sending him everything she'd been holding back, all the understanding and compassion and fierce protectiveness she felt toward this broken Alpha who'd been fighting alone for so long. Through the bond, through the gift, through the connection that was forming between their souls in ways that transcended simple mate recognition, Sarah showed Aldrich what she'd seen in his memories, showed him that she understood his rage wasn't a curse or a punishment from the moon goddess, but unprocessed grief that had been locked away for 12 years because he'd never been allowed to mourn properly, had never been given permission to break down and grieve for the parents who died protecting him when he was barely more than a child himself. She felt the moment he understood, felt his consciousness sharpen and focus through the silver haze of rage, felt him recognize that the fury consuming him wasn't actually anger at all, but sorrow that had been twisted and compressed and denied for so long that it had transformed into something violent and destructive, because grief that isn't acknowledged eventually finds other ways to express itself. The silver faded from his eyes gradually rather than all at once, his massive body slowly relaxing under her hands as the rage drained away and was replaced by the raw, overwhelming grief he'd been running from since the night he watched his mother die. And Sarah felt the exact moment when the transformation completed, when the Alpha King, who'd spent 12 years terrifying everyone around him, finally let himself feel the pain he'd been suppressing, finally let himself be vulnerable enough to break. He shifted then, the change flowing over him like water, his wolf form dissolving into the shape of a man who immediately collapsed to his knees in front of her, his hands coming up to cover his face as sobs racked his entire frame, as 12 years of held-back tears finally found their release. Sarah went to her knees beside him without hesitation, her arms wrapping around his shaking shoulders, holding him while he cried with an intensity that shook them both. And she could feel through their bond that this was the first time he'd allowed himself to truly grieve. The first time he'd let anyone see him as anything other than the strong, controlled leader his position demanded him to be. The other 11 wolves had shifted as well during Aldrich's transformation, and they stood now in human form around the perimeter of the cave, their faces showing a mixture of shock and relief, and something that looked like cautious hope, because they'd just witnessed something that had never happened before in 12 years of serving their alpha. Had just watched a stranger accomplish what dozens of healers and potential Lunas had failed to achieve. "You're not cursed," Sarah whispered against Aldrich's silver hair, her voice fierce and certain despite the exhaustion that was starting to creep through her body from the massive amount of emotional energy she'd just processed. "You're not broken or wrong or unfit to lead. You're just a man who lost his parents too young and never got to properly say goodbye. Never got to acknowledge that their death wasn't your fault, that you were a victim too, that surviving when they didn't doesn't make you guilty of anything except being alive, and being alive isn't a crime, no matter how much survivor's guilt tries to convince you otherwise." Aldrich pulled back just enough to look at her, and she saw that his eyes were red and swollen from crying, but they were also clear and blue and more present than they'd been since she'd entered this cave. More focused and aware, and fundamentally there in a way that suggested something essential had shifted inside him. Something that had been locked away had finally been released. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse and emotion, and Sarah realized this was the first time she was hearing him speak in human form. The first time words were passing between them that weren't mediated through wolf sounds or empathic impressions. "My name is Sarah Moonwhisper," she said simply, because there was no point in hiding anymore. No point in maintaining the careful anonymity she'd cultivated during her wandering years when this alpha already knew more about her through their bond than she'd shared with anyone in 2 years of isolation. "I'm a wandering Omega with an empathic healing gift that I swore I'd never use again because my old pack used me as an emotional dumping ground until I had nothing left of myself. And I was rejected by my intended mate because he said I was tainted by all the darkness I'd absorbed. Said I wasn't pure enough to be worth claiming. And so I ran. I've been running for 2 years, moving from place to place and never staying long enough to form connections because I couldn't bear the thought of being used like that again." "And yet you used your gift for me," Aldrich said, his hand coming up to touch her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone his size, from hands that had killed assassins and fought in countless battles and carried the weight of an entire kingdom's safety. "You used your gift even though it clearly hurt you, even though absorbing my rage and grief must have cost you tremendously, even though you had no reason to help a strange alpha wolf dying in a cave during a blizzard." "I had a reason," Sarah admitted, feeling vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety and everything to do with emotional exposure, with letting someone see the parts of herself she normally kept locked away behind walls of careful indifference. "The mate bond. I felt it the moment I touched you, felt the connection snap into place between us, and I know that doesn't obligate me to anything. I know that fate isn't the same as choice, and destiny isn't the same as desire. But I couldn't leave you to suffer alone when I could feel through our bond how desperately you were fighting to protect me even from yourself. How terrified you were that you might hurt me, how much guilt you were already carrying for things that hadn't even happened yet. Aldrich's expression softened into something that looked dangerously like wonder, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing, like he'd spent so long being feared and avoided that having someone choose to help him voluntarily was a concept his mind struggled to process. "I'm Aldrich Frostborn," he said formally, as if they were meeting at a diplomatic function instead of kneeling together on a cave floor surrounded by his naked and exhausted guards while a blizzard raged outside. "I'm the Alpha King of the Northern Frost Kingdom, and I've spent 12 years searching for someone who could help me manage the rage episodes that have defined my rule and destroyed any chance I had at normal relationships, at having a mate or a family or anything resembling a personal life separate from my duties as king." "And now you've found me," Sarah said, the words coming out somewhere between a question and a statement, because she wasn't entirely sure what happened next, wasn't entirely sure what finding each other meant when they were both so damaged in complementary ways, both carrying trauma that made connection difficult and trust nearly impossible. "And now I've found you," Aldrich confirmed, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a reverence that made her breath catch, made her heart stutter in her chest, made her wonder when exactly she'd stopped being terrified of forming attachments and started craving the connection she could feel building between them with every passing moment. "But I need you to understand something, Sarah. I need you to know this before anything else happens between us, before we explore what this bond means, or what we might mean to each other beyond the fact that fate apparently decided we belong together." "What do you need me to understand?" Sarah asked, holding his gaze even though part of her was terrified of what he might say, terrified that he might be about to confirm her worst fears, that he might admit he only valued her for her gift, that he might prove himself to be just like her old pack and Darius and everyone else who'd seen her as a solution rather than a person. "I won't use you," Aldrich said fiercely, his hands framing her face now, holding her gently but firmly, as if he needed her to really hear this, really believe it, really understand that he meant every word. "I won't ask you to sacrifice yourself for me, the way my mother sacrificed herself for my father. Won't expect you to absorb my darkness every time I struggle. Won't make you into the emotional support that keeps me functional at the cost of your own well-being. Because I watched what that kind of one-sided giving did to my mother, watched her fade a little more each time she used her gift to calm my father's temper. And I swore I would never do that to someone I cared about." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks, though she couldn't have said exactly why she was crying, whether it was relief or grief or exhaustion, or simply the overwhelming experience of having someone explicitly tell her that they wouldn't exploit her gift, that they saw the cost of using it and cared more about her well-being than about what she could do for them. "What if I want to help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, testing the boundaries of this new dynamic they were negotiating, trying to understand what space existed between being used against her will and choosing to offer her gift freely to someone she was starting to care about. "Then we figure it out together," Aldrich said, and she could feel through their bond that he meant it, that he was genuinely committed to finding a balance that didn't destroy her in the process of saving him. "We work on managing my grief properly now that we've identified the root cause. We develop coping strategies that don't require you to absorb my darkness every time I struggle. We build a partnership where I learn to carry my own weight instead of expecting you to carry it for me. And if you choose to help me sometimes, it's because you want to, not because I've demanded it, or because you feel obligated by the mate bond, or because you're afraid of what will happen if you say no." "I've never had that before," Sarah admitted, fresh tears spilling over because she hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until he said them. hadn't understood how deeply her old pack and Darius had damaged her sense of agency around her gift, until someone offered to give that agency back. I've never had someone care more about protecting me than about using me. Never had someone value my choice over their need. Never had someone see me as a person first and a gift second. Then let me be the first, Aldrich said, pulling her closer until their foreheads touched, until they were breathing the same air, until the mate bond between them was humming so loudly she could feel it in her bones. Let me show you what it means to be valued for who you are, rather than what you can do. Let me prove that not everyone will exploit your gift. Let me be the one who breaks the pattern of people taking from you without giving anything back. Sarah kissed him then, unable to express in words what she was feeling, but hoping he could sense it through their bond. Hoping he could understand that she was choosing him, choosing this connection, choosing to take the terrifying risk of opening herself up to someone again, despite all the times she'd been hurt before. The kiss was gentle and tentative and tasted of salt from their combined tears, but it was also full of promise, full of potential, full of the possibility that two broken people might actually be able to help each other heal instead of simply breaking each other further. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard and glowing with the energy of their bond settling into place, they found that the other wolves had tactfully moved to the far side of the cave and were focused very intently on the fire, and definitely not on their alpha and his newly discovered mate having an emotional breakthrough in the middle of a crisis situation. The blizzard was still raging outside, but the cave felt warmer now, felt safer, felt like maybe the moon goddess had led them all to exactly the right place at exactly the right time, despite how random and chaotic and dangerous it had seemed. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, echoing the question she'd asked at the beginning of this encounter, but with an entirely different tone, no longer wondering if she'd survive the night, but instead wondering what shape her future might take now that she'd found her mate in the most unexpected way possible. "Now we wait out the storm together," Aldrich said, pulling her against his side and wrapping one of the spare cloaks around both of them, because they were both still kneeling on cold stone, and exhaustion was starting to set in for both of them after the emotional intensity of the last hour. "And then, if you're willing, we travel to my palace. We figure out how to manage my condition together. We navigate the political complications of an alpha king taking a mate who appeared out of nowhere during a blizzard, and we build something that neither of us thought we could have. Something real and chosen and based on who we actually are, rather than what circumstances demanded we become." "That sounds complicated," Sarah said, but she was smiling slightly despite the challenges she knew were coming, despite the fact that her entire life was about to change in ways she couldn't fully predict. "It will be," Aldrich agreed honestly, and she appreciated that he wasn't trying to pretend everything would be easy or simple or free from struggle. "But I think it might be worth it. I think you might be worth fighting for, and I hope you'll give me the chance to prove that I can be worth fighting for too." "I think I'd like that," Sarah whispered, letting herself lean into his warmth, letting herself imagine a future that included belonging and purpose, and someone who saw her as valuable beyond her utility. And for the first time in 2 years of running, she felt like maybe she'd finally found somewhere she could stop, could rest, could build something lasting instead of just surviving day to day until exhaustion or loneliness or simple bad luck finally caught up with her. The storm raged on through the night, but inside the cave, wrapped in her mate's arms and surrounded by wolves who'd already started treating her like she was Pac, like she was Luna, like she belonged, Sarah felt warmer and safer and more hopeful than she'd felt since before her parents died and left her alone in a world that didn't know what to do. with a silver-haired Omega who absorbed darkness and carried light. She'd been running from connection for so long, terrified of being used, terrified of being broken, terrified of losing herself again the way she'd lost herself to her old pack's demands. But maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who would help her find herself instead of taking pieces until nothing remained. And as she drifted off to sleep, listening to Aldrich's heartbeat and feeling the mate bond pulse steady and strong between them, Sarah understood that sometimes the moon goddess worked in ways that seemed cruel or random or impossibly complicated, but that ultimately led you exactly where you needed to be, with exactly who you needed to find, at exactly the moment when you were both finally ready to stop running and start healing together. If you enjoyed this story of Sarah and Aldrich, the silver-matched mates who found each other in a blizzard and chose to heal together instead of breaking apart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below because your feedback helps me understand what kinds of stories resonate with you and what you'd like to see more of in future tales. What did you think of Sarah's journey from isolation to connection? Or Aldrich's struggle with his rage and grief? Or the way they negotiated their relationship around consent and choice rather than obligation and fate? And are there other werewolf romance themes you'd like me to explore in upcoming stories? Please subscribe to this channel so you never miss new stories about Alpha Kings, rejected mates, powerful Omegas, and the complicated, beautiful, sometimes painful journey of finding where you belong and who you belong with, because I post new content regularly, and your subscription helps me continue creating these emotional, intense, romantic tales of werewolves and destiny. Thank you so much for reading, for engaging, for being part of this community of people who believe in second chances and chosen families and love that transforms rather than destroys. And I'll see you in the next story, where we'll explore more of the werewolf world and the complicated hearts that inhabit it.